Thank you, everyone, for joining here. We've got nearly 100 folks online with us, so we'll give everyone the opportunity here. Quick administrative notes to remind folks: if you unmute, please remute, and we're looking forward to an hour and a half of great conversation here. My name is Karen Cameron. I'm CEO of the Ontario Public Transit Association, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome everyone to the first OPTA Live webinar. I want to thank TransPro Consulting for being first off the mark to want to provide a webinar that is being offered in place of our annual spring conference, the Ontario Transportation Expo. For the second year in a row, we were not able to get together in person, but this is our opportunity to provide the learning opportunities that OTE regularly does. With that, I'd like to turn additional introductions over to a friend of OPTA, former board member Bob Atwell. Welcome, Bob.
Thanks, Karen, and good morning, everyone. Not quite the same as being together and enjoying each other's company at the annual OTE, but we're gonna have some fun this morning. And you know what could be better? The sun is shining, the golf courses have opened, and the NHL playoffs are on. So up here in Canada, that's like being in heaven. But anyways, we'll get this started. I want to say a big thanks to Karen for organizing this. I know a lot of work goes into it, and the planning committee as well. I'm not sure who was part of that, but whoever was involved, thank you. And also thanks to everyone on this webinar. Thanks for joining us and taking the time. For anyone who doesn't know, my name is Bob Atwell. I've been in transit here in Canada for 30 years. Loved every minute of it. I'm now working with TransPro. I started in January. They are a company based in the States. They're a 10-year-old company and do lots of work, do lots of close work with many of the transit systems down there. My objective when I joined TransPro was to get them more involved and more prominent here in the Canadian market. They've done some work already up here. They've done work with YRT, they've done work with London Transit, BC Transit, and CUTA themselves. So now I am honored to be working with them and, as I said, get them more involved and more prominent in the Canadian market. So let's get rolling. We have an interesting topic for today's discussion. We have a great panel to give us our views on this topic. And I'll now turn it over to Mark Ash, our CEO, to kick it off.
Bob, thanks so much. Good morning, everyone. Karen, we feel as though we've been waiting in line all night for concert tickets, and we were able to push go faster than anyone else. And so just thrilled that we are the kickoff session for this new stage that OPTA has been able to build. So we will be front row, front and center at the concert and enjoy it enormously. Let me just give a little bit on us. We got a great panel, really looking forward to what we expect will be an industry leading conversation that so many are having is how do we think about the value that our industry brings both organizationally, but also as an industry in thinking about more than simply volume, ridership, actually thinking about value, the value that we bring. For 10 years now, as Bob was suggesting, TransPro has worked with transit systems across North America, whether it's on outcomes, whether it's thinking about customer experience, whether it's thinking about culture change or efficiency and effectiveness of service delivery, have worked on all those topics. And our passion these days is working with so many on transitioning from this topic of volume only to really thinking about value. So let me pull in my colleague, Lindsay Schofield. Lindsay's going to take a couple minutes and set this up. And then we are going to get our panelists and bring their thoughts who are really leading thinking around this topic. And I think well ahead of their industry colleagues and excited for the engagement that we're going to have with all of you of digging deep into specifically this conversation. So with Lindsay, why don't you tee us up and off we'll go.
Thanks, Mark, and thank you, everyone. I'm really honored to be here today and be able to tee up our topic for today's panel about moving beyond ridership as the primary indicator of success and really communicating the broader value of transit. So traditionally, the transit industry, as we all know, has really viewed ridership increases as the primary cause for celebration. And on the flip side, when ridership declines, we often hear that in the media as a sign of failure or ineffectiveness. And we know that neither of those is completely true. There's a lot of elements that influence these trends that really have nothing to do with the quality of the service or the value that we're delivering to communities. And we really saw that this past year plus that we're still going through, where that came into sharp relief with the COVID-19 pandemic, where ridership has plummeted and many forecasts are suggesting that ridership isn't going to return for years, and in some communities, if ever, to where it was pre-pandemic. And so despite that fact, despite the fact that many of our systems are experiencing significant declines in the volume of ridership, elected officials throughout North America have recognized that transit does provide value, and they've made significant investments to keep transit moving and to make sure that we're still investing in transit. That said, what keeps us up at night, and I'm sure it keeps a number of you up at night, and which is why there's so many of you attending the session, is that we can envision a future where in a couple of years down the road, folks on our boards, the media, elected officials are going to start asking questions and needing to be reminded of the value that they saw, because ridership again may not reach the level that it was, or recovery may take some time, and they're going to want to know what they're getting for that investment. So we think it's so important, and this is the opportunity to really seize on being prepared for that moment, not just with anecdotes about these other areas of value, but with real data that's demonstrating the success outcomes that we're delivering, the key performance indicators that are actually measuring that success, and then that we're actually proactively and strategically communicating about that success. We thought it'd be helpful to share one case study from the US, and this is Charlotte, North Carolina, where their comprehensive performance management system is designed in a way that they're measuring a comprehensive suite of metrics that demonstrate their value. So in their case, they're measuring and reporting routinely on customer satisfaction, financial sustainability, community impact, and employee success, such that only 3% of their performance score actually comes from ridership. And again, they're not talking about these things in silos. They're actually talking about this in that package of overall performance and organizational excellence. And so while this might not be the right equation for your specific agency, perhaps ridership is a larger part of how you want to define success. But the key here is that they're really putting a line in the sand. They're saying how much this is important and how they're delivering value in these other areas. And what that's allowed them to do is that even though the majority of the county in which they operate will never step foot on a bus, and they won't ever have the opportunity to serve them through transit, when they surveyed that community, over 80% consistently, survey after survey, year after year, has said that they do find value in having the transit service. And that's really important, again, because we recognize that so much of our service is funded through the taxpayers. So as we think about how we strengthen the transit industry's ability to measure and communicate value, we really see this as an opportunity to standardize and report across these other dimensions, just like we've historically done with ridership. And we know that ridership continues to be an important part of the equation. So we'll always want to have that as a metric and be conscious of what that allows us to achieve in our communities. But we also recognize that there's value in the greenhouse gas emissions and reductions in carbon emissions by having more people on a bus to get from point A to point B instead of being in single occupancy vehicles. Or we see the quality of our experience, our net promoter score, our on-time performance, and the community. So value to community partnerships, having access, the population and the jobs that we're able to connect folks to. So we see this as really a buffet of options, and each community can really pick the different elements to focus on. In the case we just shared, they asked their community, where are the areas that you see transit providing the biggest value? And in that community, economic development, economic impact is a big component. So that's what they're prioritizing as they're making decisions, and not only about what they're investing in, but how they're communicating it. And so we think there's this opportunity that even though we may prioritize different things in our local communities, that what this provides is that structure to be able to communicate that proactively at the local level, but then have a way of aggregating that up and communicating our broader value to society in a common way. And so with that, I would love to turn it over to my colleague, Erin, who's going to moderate and kick off our panel and hear how these amazing leaders that we've got lined up today are tackling this important topic in their local communities.
Thanks, Lindsay. Terrific framing of where we are today and the statement of the problem that we're focusing on. I'm Aaron Bingaman. I'm one of the principals with TransPro Consulting. Excited to be your moderator today. Got a terrific panel. I'm going to introduce the panel and then start with a question for one of our panelists. First, want to introduce Eddie Robar. He's the branch manager for Fleet and Facility Services for the City of Edmonton. Kelly Polenksny, she is the general manager with London Transit. And delighted to have Deborah Johnson from the RTD in Denver, Colorado in the States. And I'm going to start with Denver and Deborah, as she's really done an amazing job in her first 7 months as the CEO there, leading a transformation, getting people really excited about the opportunities and thinking differently about how success is measured and defined. So Deborah, let's start here as Lindsay's framed the opportunity and situation facing transit. How's Denver thinking about recovery? How is success being defined? And how are you and your team approaching success at RTD coming out of COVID?
So thank you very much, Aaron, for the introduction and the question. And I want to thank OPTA as well as TransPro for the opportunity to engage with all of you this morning. As introduced, yes, I'm Deborah Johnson. I pride myself on being a person in the people business because, hey, without people, there'd be no need for any of us as we look to move people around our dynamic communities. So with that as a backdrop, as we think about recovery, first and foremost, what does that really mean? And if anything, as we talk about recovery, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to discern what are the needs we're trying to address, and more specifically, what are our customer pain points? And we have to be able to ascertain what that is by being empathetic to what those pain points may be as we look to crawl out of this pandemic and provide the services in which those individuals need. So with that, what I would share with you as we look to the road to recovery, first and foremost, is engaging with individuals. As we have seen in the United States, and more specifically here in the Denver metro region, which is the most densely populated area within the state of Colorado, the Regional Transportation District does provide service to a vast service area. And in that vast service area, which would constitute 2,342 square miles, we can't use a cookie cutter approach in addressing what the needs are. Here in the downtown area, that's really the central business district where we have a myriad of employment sites, high-rise buildings. We also have critical activity centers. And what I mean by that, sporting event venues whereby the Major League Baseball team, the Colorado Rockies, play, the Denver Nuggets for the National Basketball Association and things of the like, and we have activities that are ongoing. But what's paramount is that we also have people that need to get to their employment sites, those essential workers we have heard about. And so as we talk about the road to recovery and what we're doing, we really need to step outside of ourselves and dismiss that former business model that we in transit have so readily used, i.e. putting out a bus stop flag, anticipating that people will come to the stop. One thing's for certain, I have learned prior to even coming to this agency, having worked at another in Southern California, is that we have to be nimble and agile and be ready to pivot. And in doing so, we have to change our mindset and recognize that deploying a train with a certain amount of cars may not be the answer, or sending out a traditional bus with a certain size. We need to ensure that we're giving people what they want, recognizing that they've been telecommuting, recognizing that there's different hybrid models. We have to step back and discern what might work best. Is there smaller vehicles that could be advantageous? But in all of that, the pivotal point that I have discerned throughout this process is that we need to go to where the people are, take their pulse, basically be able to address what their pain points are. And once we lean into that, then in turn, we can help frame the problem for which we're trying to solve. And one thing's for certain, it's about partnerships when we talk about community value. So having said that, my team and I basically are trying to create alignment and identify what our North Star is, so we can all work in earnest collectively throughout the organization with our external stakeholders and more specifically with our board. So there's no question about what we're doing. We heard Ms. Schofield talk about the benefits of the community value and so forth. So just taking into consideration if in fact we have a zero emission bus fleet, while you may not have everybody in your immediate area utilizing public transport, that value is that you're lessening the amount of cars on the road, you're creating a better environment. I came from Southern California, where I worked in the backyard of the two largest ports in the US, and there was a disproportionate amount of Black and brown children that suffered from asthma. The community value was that we were cleaning the air even though they weren't riding our vehicles. So with that, I'll yield the floor and give my colleagues an opportunity to address. So thank you very kindly for the opportunity.
Thanks, Deborah. That's a great start. I want to invite folks observing here to go ahead and feel comfortable to start to issue some questions. If you hear something one of our panelists say, you want to learn more about that or add that, drop that into the chat feature. We'll be keeping an eye on that as we continue into our rapid fire phase. Kelly, Deborah talked a little bit about partnerships and community expectations and how their team is starting to frame that. Kelly, how is London Transit thinking about managing expectations around ridership, around policy, around those customer expectations of what service needs to be looking like coming out of COVID in this context of value v. volume?
Thanks for that. Obviously, a lot of similar things to what Deborah already spoke about, but just in terms of moving forward and you know, like every system and probably everybody represented on this call, we all turned very quickly to, you know, what's our rebuilding plan? We all started to think about that very early on. And, you know, here in London, and again, probably similar to many others, we traditionally operated on a 5-year service planning cycle where we would create our plans for the next 5-year horizon, looking at, you know, where we plan to grow our services, what our priorities were, things like that. And what we did this year is essentially turn that 5-year plan on its head and say, you know, we need to look at things differently. We don't know that the ridership patterns and the demands that were in place pre-pandemic are going to be there going forward. We need to do the things that our customers have been asking for as long as I've been here, and I'm not going to tell anybody that, but it's been a very long time, that we've just never responded to because we've been stuck in that in that mode of, as Deborah spoke about, the financial return. Where are we getting the best bang for our buck? How can we continue to improve efficiencies and increase those rides per service hour? So what we essentially did is we turned our mind back to, what were those longstanding issues that we've heard about from customers, and one of the biggest has been the frequency. I'm almost embarrassed to say, have a number of routes that continue to operate on 60-minute frequencies. And that is not viable transit service. That is not something that is attractive, certainly to new riders, but it's also not attractive to the riders that we do have utilizing that service. Nobody wants to take the chance that they're missing a bus and have to wait for an hour for the next one. So what we went to our board and our council with, in terms of service improvements that we're looking to put in it starting the end of this year and then early in 2022, is reducing the frequencies on all of those routes to something in the 30 to 40 minute range initially. So system-wide improvements that will address those concerns of, the people that relied on our service throughout the pandemic, those essential workers that needed that service. It's going to improve options for them, but we're also hoping that it will make the service just in general more viable and attractive to customers whose travel patterns may have changed, but they'll still see transit as a viable option, maybe not for all trips, but for some trips.
Great, excellent, excellent setup there, Kelly. And want to shift to Eddie Robar. First question to you is, what did you all learn coming out of COVID about how you think about the value of the service you're providing?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think at the end of the day, we've had some significant experiences here that really shone a light on the importance of what we're doing and what we do is an industry. I think there's an element of the reduction in transit service that happened throughout this pandemic that really shone a light on just how privileged transit systems are. And when you look at that point of privilege, it's really built around that choice customer. And I think when we reduced service here in the city of Edmonton, it was really an interesting experience because the people that got impacted were the people that needed it the most. And I think that was a really big highlight for us. Not something that we were naive to, but something that would really never stood out until we actually had to do that service reduction just to maintain a level of service for the customers. But certainly that highlight for us, kind of unlike others, we're kind of already on a path here in the city of Edmonton. We are changing the mindset of the way that people look at transit service. We are looking at value versus ridership, and we have been for the past 5 years. So fortunately for us, we're already on a path to this conversation and changing our transit system to be one of affordability and accessibility. And I think those were the two things that we've kind of highlighted here in the city of Edmonton over the past 5 years, and have really implemented changes to kind of highlight that. And most recently, we've changed our entire transit network, and that was implemented on April 25th of this year. And it took about 5 years to kind of get to this point, albeit that was initially set out to be a ridership growth plan, now becomes a COVID recovery plan. But certainly with that approach, it was a multi-layered system. So we are looking at the frequencies of service like Kelly had spoke to earlier. We are looking at the accessibility from a citywide approach, and investing in the transit system, knowing that we may not get the returns that we would want to see. So, from a city perspective, that investment and large investments, whether it's our layered service where the transit network design has changed, but also adding in the largest on-demand system in North America. Looking at how do we get to all corners of our city, make sure that people have access to mobility, and really build on our city plan and drive that economic engine, and have that transit system as a base for that work. And further to what kind of Deborah was talking about on the GHG side of the fence, heavy investment for us in electrifying our fleet. We have 40 buses currently. We're going up to 60 soon. But also looking at building new garages that support, 250 to 300 electrified buses. So, those approaches require heavy investment and impact our cost recovery. So when we look at that from a city perspective, that mindset in the city of Edmonton has already changed, has already been in the conversation around ridership is not the key initiative that we're working for. We're really looking to build a great city, and great cities have great transit. Mobility is a part of that. And just to highlight some of that on-demand system that we implemented here on the 25th in conjunction with the transition of our entire fleet of April, it really is a $10 million, $11 million investment for the city of Edmonton with no revenue. So we never projected revenue for that implementation. Our city council accepted the fact that we are trying to connect communities. What we get from it is great, but we're not solely focused on what that ridership means. We're just trying to get people connected into the network itself. So you can get on that demand service for free in your community. It takes you to a hub. That hub, you could end up going for groceries if you want to, get back on the bus, go home for free, or you can get onto the system and then you would pay at that point. So it's those kinds of mindset changes, I think, that we're looking at in the city of Edmonton. It's kind of that kind of investment in the mobility of our citizens in this city that really are changing the way that we look at the value of transit, and we're accepting that we may have to supplement a bit more on our end of it to make sure that we're providing the access and the ability to kind of service our communities with a great transit service. So I think that transition is happening right now. We're seeing it happen here in the city, and it's a great thing to see. And I think that investment and that mindset change is really indicative of kind of the great things that are getting done here in the city.
One of the things all three of your organizations have in common is a commitment to measurement and objectively measuring data, either building the systems today to get your organizations to be there and or consistently doing that. Deborah shared a story, an amazing story about contributing to the reduction of asthma as a community outcome. Eddie talked about electrification of fleet and contribution to greenhouse gases. How can we, and this is a question for the whole panel, how can we as an industry, turn that from an episodic story to something that is fundamentally measurable and institutionally becomes what we measure and communicate as part of the value we deliver?
If I may, I believe it's really imperative upon all of us to change the narrative. As I look where I am specifically, my board in particular, recognizing that not everybody is a transportation professional or possesses that acumen. For so long, we've talked about ridership as if that's the end all be all, as you all have successfully teed up with the entree into this discussion. And if anything, we can increase ridership. We all know that. But when we do that, is that the type of ridership we want to be reflective of our transit systems? And will it basically service all in the manner in which most transit agencies, to Eddie's point, were created, right? And being the connectivity, the fabric that's interwoven in any community. So as we talk about how we go forward as an industry, I think collectively we need to talk about the importance of public transport, which was really magnified during the course of the pandemic. It really changes the narrative holistically, because it ultimately is value more than volume, in the sense that when individuals that do have other mobility options, what will entice them to utilize our respective transportation systems in lieu of other modes of transport? Now, I'm not talking about us being in competition with any other mobility service or what have you. we should look at ourselves as being complementary, but basically leaning in and educating, at least in my realm, in the situation in which I am in, hearing from so many different factions that it's about ridership, 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 and we just need people, and not basically having an understanding of what that really means and what we're driving for, no pun intended, I think is the first narrative. And then with all of us collectively being in this dynamic industry, we all need to be singing from the same sheet of music and have a collective message around that, so we can ensure that we're educating and informing about the great benefit of public transportation being the great societal equalizer and also being an economic driver.
Eddie or Kelly, anything to add? Yes. I saw Kelly go.
Oh,
go ahead,
you
Kelly.
want, I can, yeah, okay. I would completely agree with Deborah. I mean, it's something that we all have to buy into and start talking. And I would say, adding to that, I think timing is imperative. The benefits that transit brought to communities over the last year during the pandemic is fresh in everyone's minds and in all stakeholder minds. And I don't think this is something that we can leave simmering on a back burner for 2 or 3 years until these problems come home to roost to start talking about it. I think we need to start changing, the narrative right away. And I can say just very quickly, part of our business planning process here in London is that we produce an annual report every year that reports out on our, on our traditional KPIs, the riderships, the rides per service hour, that type of thing. And when I was preparing the 2020 report, that's when it really hit home for me that, we missed every metric. I mean, we operated, our average rides per hour were lower than the threshold that we would have for even traditionally considering putting a route in place. So, but all of that happened in a year where we've never had stronger support from all levels of government and from our community for doing what we're doing. So something's wrong. How can I have a report with all of these negative metrics when it's a year that we've never been more supported? And again, I want to emphasize, now is the time. And I think there's certainly a role to play. I mean, in Deborah's case, it would be OPTA. In the majority of our cases, CUTA, in the data that we're collecting and the data that our associations are reporting out. We have to start talking about more than those traditional metrics and making that a consistent message across, system-wide across the nation.
Eddie, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I think maybe back to what Deborah was saying a little bit in terms of the economic engine. I think that's the big piece of what we're looking at here in the city of Edmonton and how we're connected as a city as a whole. Instead of just thinking about a transit system as an isolated business unit inside the city itself, it's really a driver of the growth of a city. How are we connected? How is our planning connected into our transit system? Using that as the base infrastructure for people to get around. People moving around is good business for everyone. And I think, that piece is a bit of that kind of value that we're looking at from the city of Edmonton, and that mobility is key to success of a city. And people moving around, getting around, and doing that in a way that's easy and connected. And I think with our approach, we've taken that expansion of our transit system to every corner of our city and beyond. There's lots of cities on the periphery of the city of Edmonton, and we're connecting them too. So we're thinking even beyond our own boundaries and borders, because people don't care. They don't care what municipal boundary they're crossing. They don't care. They just want it to be easy and convenient. And with our new smart fare structures and what we're doing on that tapless system piece, we're integrated throughout the region. So it doesn't matter if you're leaving St. Albert, coming into the city of Edmonton, or coming from Strathcona or Leduc or Spruce Grove. All of that stuff is connected. And I think, that seamless connectivity and that ability to kind of drive the economic engine of our cities is absolutely imperative to where we end up in the long run. And I think, moving our mindset from just a transit system and what does that recovery look like to how are we building our cities is kind of that mindset change that we need to kind of get into.
It's really interesting, right? As we listen to the themes that you all have highlighted, right? We hear your organizations being focused on community value, economic impact, financial sustainability, right? These are meaningful outcomes that are beyond the episodic. And Kelly, I think you did such a great job of capturing, this moment that we've all experienced in this industry over the last 18 months, the word essential, right? that word essential became one of the defining characteristics of the work that we do. And what we're concerned about, is Lindsay set up the problem statement, is how do we frame that value that is so far beyond, just beyond ridership, in terms of what we do, and objectively measuring data that helps us do that. I want to talk a little bit more about that word essential, and coming out of COVID. I think, Deborah, you hit on this, and want to ask Eddie and Kelly maybe to lead first. Deborah talked about the new partnerships and the collaborations that emerged for her team in Denver, coming out of the COVID experience, and this recognition within the community around being essential. Kelly or Eddie, either one go first here. Just what new partnerships have emerged for you? How is that creating an opportunity for you on articulating the value that your systems are delivering to your community today?
Yeah, I think, maybe I'll start, but I think, as far as looking at what new things happened through the pandemic and different ways of doing things, it was really interesting to us to really look at different partnerships and opportunities that we had during the pandemic itself. When we reduced service, we knew we were impacting people in a negative way on the essential service worker side of the work that we've been doing. We actually used our paratransit system to supplement shuttle services for those essential workers at hospitals. So we knew our ridership was extremely low. We repurposed that. Instead of cutting that service on the on-demand side of it, we actually created an opportunity for hospital workers to book rides as part of that paratransit work, and we were picking them up and taking them to the hospitals, because we knew that the impact that we had on them with the inconvenience of our service was negatively affecting their ability to get to and from work. And we used that pretty much through the entire reduction in our service time frame, which was about probably about 3 months worth of time, to supplement the service for those essential workers, which is a partnership I didn't think we would get into. We were like, what are we going to do with this service? Should we cut it? How do we provide, is there other ways to repurpose it in a way, which again comes back to value, I think, when we talk about value and what does that mean? Looking at, we could have cut the service and then saved the money and done all of that. But instead of doing that, we kind of repurposed the work to provide a significant level of service for those hospitals and essential workers, so that they could get to and from work in a convenient way, instead of negatively impacting the way we did. I think that was an important kind of learning lesson for us, and new partnership. And then the social service sector. I've never been more involved in social services in my 20-year transit career than I was throughout the pandemic, and looking at ways to connect people to the support services that they need. And in times of the pandemic and the reduction of people on the street and ability for people to access businesses and social supports, and what that means, I think we spent a ton of time getting those folks connected to the services and social supports through shuttle services and other opportunities, and connecting with our social service sector to make sure that people could get the helps and supports that they needed. And I think that essential part of what we can do to help supplement some of that city side of it is something that hasn't gone away, and is a new part of this world that we're in, that we're also supporting through our transit service.
Kelly, anything you wanted to add to that?
I think the experience here in London was very similar, and one of the things that evolved or happened very quickly once the pandemic was declared is our city declared a state of emergency, which then activated our emergency control group, which I sit on. And very similar things to what Eddie talked about happened. I would be on the call talking about needing to reduce our services to lesser than what was currently in place, given our employee availability. And I've got the head of a hospital saying, oh my God, you can't reduce this route because I've got a whole crew of nurses that takes that bus home at night. And if you reduce that service, then they can't get home. So, and we were dynamically modifying routes on those calls. I was hanging up talking to our planners saying, hey, I know this is what we planned, but we've got to leave this in place because we've got a group of workers. So it really demonstrated also that we can be a whole lot more flexible than I think we traditionally have been. We were all very much set in our ways in terms of how we planned routes and how long it took to get things up and running, and, you know, the data that we used and that type of thing. So, but a lot of those dynamic things happened just, you know, through the course of the pandemic. And again, with the underlying objective of meeting the needs of those people who were really relying on us throughout that period. But again, one of the benefits was, you know, all of the community leaders in London were on those calls, and they were all participating in that, and they all saw the need for transit to keep running and keep the community moving.
Thank you. There's been a couple questions come through the chat. Again, want to encourage folks to continue to use that platform to ask us questions. And I'm going to ask Mark, pull up a chair to the moderator. And I'm going to ask you, how do we think about an outcome in comparison to a key performance indicator? What's the guidance you would want to give the industry today here at OPTA about the difference between those two things as we start to frame measuring value?
Yeah, so we really think about this through sort of a three-level tier. So the first is thinking about the outcome which we desire. The second is thinking about the activities which we would engage in as an organization to produce those outcomes. And then the third is thinking about the KPIs, the key performance indicators, which we would measure to see if the activities are positioning us to actually produce the outcome. Let me give an example. Many organizations, in fact, I'm sure everyone on this call, measures on-time performance. But the reality is, if we were somehow able to produce 100% on-time performance, but customer satisfaction fell, then we didn't produce the desired objective. The desired outcome, which we care about, is actually happier customers. That's what we care about. The leading KPI to produce happier customers is typically on-time performance. And so as we think about this particular topic, I think it's really aligning as an industry, what are the 6 or 7 outcome areas that we would focus on? Congestion, volume, quality, equity, job access. You know, there'd be a host of those which we would put in place. I'm not going to capture them all here. And then it's thinking about what are the KPIs that we would measure the production of realizing those outcomes. As an industry, we could actually measure and communicate that. But the answer in Denver is going to be different than the answer in Edmonton. They're going to prioritize those in a different way, but it builds the platform for us as an industry to prove that these elected officials were right when they invested so much when our volume was at its lowest. But we do need to sing off of a common song sheet rather than having, as Deborah so beautifully articulated, how do we move from the episodic stories of that to having that be a regular part of our narrative with clear facts?
Thanks for that, Mark. I think that, well, let me ask the panel, any reactions to Mark's framing there before I ask my next question?
I just want to add this. I think that was spot on. And I actually shared something recently with my board when we talk about on-time performance. And I'm sure many of you on this call define it in similar ways. For us within the transit agency, you know, we're on time. We could be a minute early and 5 minutes late. But if I'm someone who's working a frontline job and I need to be there at a specific time to clock in, and the headways have changed, and say, for instance, I'm only taking a 15-minute ride and I'm expecting my bus to be there at 8 o'clock, and basically it shows up at 8:05 a.m. From our vantage point, we're still on time, but for that frontline employee that needs to, you know, basically clock in, we're putting his or her livelihood at risk, because they're looking at our schedule as a commitment that we made that we'll get them there when we say we're going to get there. But for all intents and purposes, we were on time, but is that yielding customer satisfaction? And that's one thing that I really have been able to lean into You know, about 2 agencies ago, as I engage with people and everybody's purporting about this on-time performance, but in actuality, we're extrapolating critical elements like, oh, we were on time, but there was a detour. I'm sorry, when we drive in our own cars, if there's a detour, aren't you still late to your appointment, or you say to whomever you were meeting, oh, that doesn't count, I was technically on time. So I think there's a lot of validity in reference to what Mark said. And if we just reshape our mindsets, as what Kelly said, talking about the data that we have at CUDA and at APTA, as we start looking at this through the customer lens to ensure that we're yielding that satisfaction, the value collectively, the community value of what we bring will inform that narrative with our, you know, elected leaders and things of the like, when we really place that value in transportation. And I just want to say in reference to what happened with the pandemic, I'm not making light of this, but for all intents and purposes, let's capitalize on it, and let's not let a good crisis go to waste. And exactly what Kelly said, we have to pounce on this to go forward. Thanks.
Yeah, and just maybe to follow up on that, I was going to say the same thing. I think we collectively as an industry have an opportunity, and I think, you know, with this opportunity, it's that transition, and this political environment that we lead and live, you know, is contingent on we know getting money is a ridership thing from the federal government in Canada. You know, they really place a lot of emphasis on what the ridership looks like and how they dole out funding and how it gets distributed. But we almost have to change that narrative and that conversation. And this is the opportunity to do that. I think, you know, when we look at transit and we go into the future, how we plan transit systems now, it's going to change. You know, the way that we look at crush loads is going to change. The way that our passengers look at crush loads, it's going to change. You go in this philosophical approach of planning services so you get as many people on a bus as you possibly can. It's going to change. And I think, you know, with that change, we have a huge opportunity to really change the industry, change the narrative, and change the way that we look at transit in the future. And that piece for me is kind of why I have been involved in doing what I do. And, you know, part of what I'm like looking for in the future is to try and change that narrative and that mindset to say, what value are we adding to the cities and how do we then fund that? So KPIs are a part of that, but you need a collective group and an industry collective to change that mindset as a whole. And you can't do it, you know, one system at a time. You know, you really have to get that narrative, because, you know, everybody's going to look at that as, okay, well, does that give me value from a government perspective, or my funding, or how do we change that concept moving forward? But this stuff changes overnight. I mean, I looked at, you know, our transit system specifically, and, you know, we implemented safety shields. We were doing that prior to the pandemic, where we were installing bus shields in our buses. Huge conversation in the transit industry around, does that mean your bus system is safe? How does that get represented from a customer perspective prior to the pandemic? And overnight, that whole stereotype shifted the minute the pandemic hit. It was a safety initiative. It was, you know, part of this new program that helped our drivers and customers kind of keep that separation and that barrier. And you go from this stereotype of the unsafe transit system to now being, you guys are doing such a great safety initiative overnight. And I think, you know, those things can change and those mindsets can change. And we really got to look at what those industry metrics are, that, and granted, it's going to be different for each community and how that looks, but those industry metrics that we can start pushing to say, you know, this is the value that we provide. We've seen it through the pandemic, jump on the opportunity and start shifting the mindset of our political partners.
It's such an interesting takeaway. And I think, Kelly, you talked about this earlier as well, that there are our traditional metrics that we wanted to be inverse with what we had expected them to be, right? I mean, in order to promote public health and safety, we had to minimize the number of people on our vehicles, but we needed to keep our vehicles running because we were essential.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Kelly.
Yeah, sorry. And as Eddie said, I mean, I don't think it's that our customer expectations will change. They have changed. they've changed already, and we as service providers need to recognize that. And I'm not sure for the foreseeable future that you know, our traditional crush loads are going to be acceptable to any riders. There's not that comfort level yet. We may get back there, but I think it's going to be quite some time, which, you know, puts in jeopardy all of our financial models, where we have, especially in Ontario, relied very heavily on our fare box to fund our operating budget. So, you know, it's part and parcel, you know, talking about how we continue to sell what we're doing. I think it's also, though, we do have to recognize that we also have to change. We can't continue to do what we've always been doing and just expect someone to come to the table with more money to let us keep doing what we're doing. And, you know, Deborah talked about it, you know, right off the start. We have to get better at responding to our customers. And while the focus still needs to be trying to attract new customers as well, the better that transit system is at meeting the needs of our existing customers, the better it's going to be for everyone. And that's part of what we have to start recognizing, versus that, you know what, we've got this group of riders and we'll call them captive. So let's stop worrying about them and let's look at how we can get some new ones. And unfortunately, you know, that group of captive riders, who are the ones that are supporting us, and they're our bread and butter, they're the ones that we can rely upon, are the ones that get forgotten about.
So important. And I think the thing that has emerged for me, right, and reminded me in the last 5 or 10 minutes is listening to the discussion. The theme of today's session is moving beyond ridership from volume to value. That doesn't mean that ridership doesn't matter, right? It is still an indicator of success about what we're doing. We certainly, I mean, we want to continue to grow ridership because of the positive impact that it has, but that what we're saying is we do more. And so how well are we as an industry at communicating that point? We've allowed ridership to be the only indicator of success. And that then limits the story we get to tell. And so I want to talk about the stories for a minute. I'm going to, again, Mark, I'm going to invite you back to the table. When we think about, there's a strategic communication challenge right here that has to unfold. We all have our reporting requirements to our provinces and our states. We have our reporting requirements to our federal authorities and all that stuff. We're still gonna value ridership, right? But we're not making it the only value. Mark, as you think about the common denominators of successful communication programs, as an organization starts this cultural shift of redefining what success looks like, redefining the value we deliver to community, what are those common denominators of really strong, successful communication programs that our attendees can take away with them today?
Well, one of the hopes that we certainly have as a team and the clients that we work with is that a year from now, when a reporter sticks a microphone in a CEO's face and says, your ridership is only 76% of what it was before COVID began, how do you defend all this money that you've received? That the CEO is able to say, at fill in the blank of our agency, the way we define success is on a comprehensive basis. On our website, you will see that our board has adopted a policy that we identify success based across a number of factors. And in a measurable way, we actually are delivering success completely consistent with what we have been invested in delivering. That we don't play that game of being in a defensive posture that, quote, ridership isn't at the level. To the point that you're making, Aaron, and I think all of our panelists are passionately agreeing with, volume will always be an element of our success. By definition, it should be. It's simply not the only measurement of success. And how do we put literally on our website the way we define success? We saw the Charlotte example that Lindsay shared with us at the outset. They articulate success across 4 factors. Volume matters. They've decided that it's 3%. Maybe you'll decide it's 33%. Let's agree it's not 100%. And so it's how do you clearly articulate that? And how do you use every vehicle at your disposal news conferences, board meetings, speeches that you give, direct mail to elected officials. How do you push that message out and not take the bait that volume is all that matters? That's the key factor. How do we get on offense on this rather than be on defense? And to the point that Eddie made, we need to do that now. We don't get to do that 18 months from now. We've got to grab it right now before we're having to defend that volume hasn't come back to pre-COVID levels.
Mark, I'm not sure if you want to keep going. I think we've lost Aaron for a bit.
We got ourselves frozen on that. So I would love, so I will do my best, Aaron. So I'd love to pull the panel in no particular order. As you can see, we've tried to make this kind of fast moving. Could you maybe speak a little bit, each of the panelists? I was trying to bring some urgency to this. Could you talk of how that resonates and how your particular organization is thinking about the fact that elected officials have invested at such a high level now? How are you all thinking about the urgency of changing this conversation?
I can jump in if that's all right. I think, for the city of Edmonton, I guess, it comes back to, we've been on this road for probably the last 5 years. So affordability, accessibility, we're really building a city plan that was connected, looking at our economy and trying to make sure that we're kind of doing the right things in that regard. The issue then comes into, how does that translate more to the global industry side of it? And I think that's where we've probably had more challenges, I guess, is that, what does investment mean? What does it mean if we put $10 million more into our system, but we're not projecting $1 more in revenue? I think those are the things that, for me, I'm looking at, how do we have those conversations and represent the value, and we do that through access, access to the system itself, providing a level of service that is seen as adequate for the community, and really layering those service elements and tailoring each service to the community that it provides that service to. And I think that, for us, and that impact and the reaction that we're getting from our city and citizens that live within it, and getting them connected to the service network, which they never had those connections before, I think is showing that value, and is a good business case for what great transit service can do for a city. And our hope is that evolves over time. And I agree with you. There's an element of volume that still matters. And our hope is that great kind of that transition that we've just made on April 25th is the kind of thing that's going to generate that going forward. And I think that, for me, is really what we want to represent to those people who fund our transit systems, the taxpayers who invest money in it, and we're asking to be like subsidizing more of that portion of that for a greater conversation around the mobility system in the cities that we live in. And I think the mobility system itself comes back to the economics of how cities like work and thrive and really do the stuff that big cities are supposed to do. And I think at the end of the day, it's representing that value to our political partners, and investing their time and effort into supporting us through that journey. And I think we've got great support in the city so far. I think we're looking to make sure that kind of continues through our provincial partners and our federal partners as well, and really showing the value and the connectivity that we're going beyond even our city borders to make sure that we're connected as a city, and I think and as a region. And I think that piece for me is that expansion of our conversation from just a city growth plan to a regional connectivity and mobility plan. I think is something that kind of leaps beyond traditional sense of approach, and has allowed us to really invest time and invest heavily. Like, I mean, the investment that the city of Edmonton has made into their transit system in the past 5 years is absolutely significant, and it absolutely hits against our cost revenue ratios. But we're doing it for the greater accessibility and the economic engine that city can be in this kind of 5, 10, 15-year time frame. And we're building for that long-term goal and not just the short term.
Deborah, how are you thinking about urgency?
Well, first and foremost, recognizing that I've been in my seat just shy of 7 months, it's for me, it's very urgent. As we collectively, when I speak of we, I'm talking about myself along with the board in partnership, as well as members of my leadership team, we have to be aligned and we have to have an understanding of what we're working towards, because if not, that will not enable us to be successful. But more specifically, as I talked about the importance of partnering, one thing that's paramount is that we need to get to the people that actually have the experience in utilizing our system, so they garner the understanding and can share what that ultimate value is. What I have discerned in my time here is that oftentimes it's anecdotal information from which we're getting from an elected official who heard, for hands from somebody else about what's happening and may not be well in tune with the operability of our system or how it works. So it's this vicious game of telephone that gets things distorted. And recognizing that our elected officials are representing those communities that make up the constituencies, it's important that we lean in, engage with them more so then we can go back and say, well, we've heard from this customer segment that they value this. We've heard from this customer segment that they value that. And I think if anything, that's where I'm coming from. So then we can collectively understand what this is. So then when I am engaging with a member of my board who happens to be a policy body that's directly elected by a constituency as well, I can say, well, you're saying you're hearing this. Well, we've spoken with these individuals. So the importance that I am trying to stress is going to where the people are, engaging with them, have them be our brand ambassadors for all intents and purposes. And I keep seeing things in the chat about Net Promoter Score, but for all intents and purposes, ensuring that these people are our promoters and not our detractors, because that basically gives more credence to what we're doing collectively. And to the point that you made, Eddie, which I think is spot on, when we talk about what it is collectively for our regions in reference to development, and we talked about economic drivers and things of the like, one thing that's really telling here in Denver, recognizing that the Denver International Airport, even in the midst of the pandemic, was one of the 10 busiest airports in the entire world. Our Denver Union Station, which is one intermodal hub, basically has a direct rail line that goes to the airport. In the midst of the pandemic, that was the most successful commuter rail line within the US during this period. So we still had individuals, and I'm not talking about air travel, we still had people trying to get to their essential jobs in the airport, whether they were Transportation Security Administration, individuals working at the magnetometers to screen people, or are we talking about people working in the Burger King? All of these things are important aspects when we step back and look and discern what is that value to the community as a whole. How are people going to have jobs? Because basically, as I said before, it being public transportation is that vehicle, pun intended, that unleashes people from their limitations. And when we talk about the benefits holistically, all that needs to be taken into consideration with development, transit-oriented development. Specifically, we here at Denver RTD recently had our board adopt equitable transportation or transit-oriented development policy. Now, we don't have auspices over land use, but we do have some park and ride lots, right? And so basically, do we really want people parking, or do we want some equitable TOD where people can start walking and access transit? Because what we've learned from a body of research in our immediate area, the vast majority of people that are utilizing public transportation that may be on the lower economic rung of the ladder basically are walking to access transit. So all of this is intertwined and comes full circle.
Kelly, anything you want to add on the urgency topic?
I think Eddie and Deborah have pretty much hit on everything that I would say as well.
So we started, I'll go back to the beginning, right? We started with a framing of a problem, right? If we don't change how we define success. Other people will. We run the risk of, in the very near term, being looked at as, not a great investment if we're only allowing ridership to be our measure of success. As I've heard, our panelists talk, we've talked about one of the critical things we need to do is define what success looks like and be clear on those different values, outcomes that we intend to achieve as an organization, and have started to talk about how we actually do that. So changing the way we do things, being agile in the decision making around the problems that we're trying to solve, building information systems that objectively allow us to measure, being aggressive in the communication process. One of the things I wanted to ask our panel was, as your organizations have shifted this mindset to be thinking about outcomes, how does that influence your budget making decision? How do you prioritize your budget investments, and what's your approach when you have an outcomes-based mindset in defining success? They didn't know I was going to ask them this question. Eddie, your light turned green first. Give us a go.
Yeah, I can jump in. I think it's totally transformed the way we look at our budgets, how we prioritize work, what's the most important piece. And I think, if I ever thought I would be looking at installing UV systems on my entire transit fleet, I would have thought you're nuts, 6 months ago. And I think that's, that became a priority, right? Shields on buses, which we were installing in the beginning, became a priority for us to kind of finish that work as quickly as possible. And I think, it transforms the way that we look at our budgets in the future. It certainly is impacting our priority approach and how we look at collectively recovering from the pandemic. And part of like the UV system I'm talking about is we've got approval to kind of move ahead with a $6 million project to install that on all of our fleet. Albany's seen great results in the work that they're doing there, but that is a new balance of creating a safe environment or getting people back onto a bus where we can say, hey, we've done something to change the way we do business. And I think each element of our plan has to be reevaluated in a way that we're taking into account what this new world looks like. What is life after the pandemic going to look like? What's the comfort level of our customers? What do they need? What do they want? And I think those elements and kind of what Deborah was talking about is really understanding your customer base and really taking that customer service approach first. I mean, it's the same thing we've done with electrifying our fleet. We chose long range buses and not short range buses because we didn't want to be impacted, if a charger went down and having to flip out those buses, or in the fact that we didn't want to plan our routes from a charging station out. Our buses that we have here in Edmonton are electrified. They are long range buses, and it's just like any other bus. It can do any other piece of work we have in our system. And we wanted to make sure that we kept that customer centered approach on the services that we have, so that we're not planning a service from a charger out, we're planning a service from the customer out. And I think that piece for me, and not losing sight of who we're doing this for and why we're trying to get the access and the mobility, I think is important. But certainly as we look at our future budgets and we're starting to plan our next 4-year budget, what we had initially thought we would be investing in is a different conversation now. It certainly has changed, where those priorities lie, how we change our city to be effectively managing what a post-pandemic world looks like. And I think if we're not all doing that right now, we should be. And that impact is not insignificant, and it's not without investment. And I think that's another component of when we talk about value and the investment of what that conversation looks like, that goes far beyond ridership ever could.
I can just add to what Eddie said. I mean, we're in the same boat. We're looking at starting to plan our next 4-year budget, which will essentially be approved by a potentially brand new municipal council, with Ontario municipal elections will be the fall of 2022. So that goes a bit to my earlier conversations with respect to the urgency, and it ties in nicely even with what Deborah said in terms of, obviously, yes, this is what we as transit administrators need to be talking about. We need to change the dialogue, but at the same time, I've always believed that me telling the story isn't nearly as effective as the voters in the community telling the story directly to the people who are knocking on the doors at election time or considering budget, and not just, and you know, the voice of the customer, the net promoter score, that's been great for us. It's really helped us in London demonstrate, you know, what the customer wants and how we're responding to that. And that's been very effective. But I think in addition to hearing from the rider, we also have to find a way to tap into the non-rider, who is Deborah. I think one of the illustrations that Deborah provided was, you know, that there's a whole community out there that may not utilize our services, but we need them to see the benefit of those services and what benefits are coming to the community as a result of those, to make them, you know, make them aware and happy to be, you know, having their tax dollars supporting those services, whether or not they want to use them. And again, it's, you know, timing wise, we do need to seize the moment. I mean, especially here in Ontario, when we've got municipal elections, you know, not too far on the horizon. And I can say, you know, we had a board meeting last night, and the headline this morning in the local paper was London Transit ridership, you know, continues to be low, and yet they're talking about service improvements. What's going on was essentially the, you know, the bent of the article. And that's exactly what we need to start trying to get away from.
Want to ask the whole panel. This is an industry perspective. So Deborah, I'm going to start with you. This is really a question for the industry. What is inside the industry? What do you see is our biggest challenge in shifting this mindset to expand our definition of success to the value we deliver beyond ridership? Deborah?
Thank you for that question, Aaron. And I chuckle because perhaps this won't be an answer people like, but I think it's us. I mean, we've been in this space for how long? I mean, you know, Eddie was talking about 20 years. I'm in my 29th year. Kelly, you didn't want to mention it, but I surmise you've been in this space for a long time as well, right? And one thing for certain, we are people, and change is hard, and you literally and figuratively cannot spell the word challenge without the word change. And so until we collectively rally around this issue and say, hey, we can redefine the narrative and speak to it from a place of knowing, that's the first step in changing the headline that Kelly just talked about in the article and the bent on it all. We have to get away with, oh, ridership, ridership, ridership. It's important. We agree. We all agree, because of course we're not going to be running, you know, empty rail consists and empty, you know, buses. But for all intents and purposes, what are we really trying to do? We're trying to get people where they need to go, when they want to get there, in a mode of transport that basically is going to enable them to tout it to their friends. Until we start putting that emphasis on value over volume, we are going to still be stuck here talking about what we should be doing as opposed to what we can actually do. So I know that's going to win the popularity contest.
Just to follow up on that, I was going to say the exact same thing almost. I was just going to say fear. You know, like, I think fear of being the trailblazer, being out front, having those conversations on the forefront of this, and I think that's the biggest thing that holds people back, because, you know, sometimes that can negatively impact the ability for you to get what you need. And I think, you know, that's always a fear of a transit property or a transit system, is if I go down this road, will it negatively impact my ability to grow the system or do the things that we need to do, taking a different philosophical approach to the work that we've done for 20 years. And I think, adaptability is key in all of this, and being, that change agent, and, all the hokey words that go along with that. But at the end of the day, you got to step out front and start pushing that envelope in discussion. And I think, you can't be fearful of that. And I think at the end of the day, I always say logic and reason wins out. And when you start to put logic and reason to the stuff that we're talking about here, it makes sense. And at the end of the day, it makes good business sense, for cities, and collectively, when we're connected, when transit systems are connected to their cities and don't become an offshoot of it, I think it helps us collectively manage that work and show the value that we can provide from a great mobility system for cities. And I think that piece for me, and overcoming that fear of what the first step looks like, I think is key to success in all of this.
Yeah, I would agree with both of the speakers, and I would just say, I mean, and I think the fear is inherent. I mean, certainly in the past. I mean, I know I think for all of us, it's always a battle. We're always fighting for tax dollars with, all kinds of other services. And there's always been that fear, but I'll go back to what I said earlier. I don't think, I mean, certainly in my history, I can't remember a time when I've seen greater levels of support from all stakeholders for transit as I have over this last year. And I really think that seizing the opportunity that we've got right now should alleviate some of that fear, because we're all in that position right now where that support is still there, and people still remember all of those good news stories and all of the things that transit did. And I think, now more than ever is the opportunity to start to change that dialogue.
And maybe just as an example, just to jump in as an example on top of that, I've been in this industry a really long time, and I think, I've not heard, if I've heard it once, I've heard it 1,000 times, that the federal government will never fund operational business in transit. Well, that changed during the pandemic, and I think it's the first time they've ever funded operational services in a very, very, very long time. And I think that that element of the changes now and staying on top of this stuff is the perfect timing, and the opportunity exists for us to kind of continue that narrative and conversation, so that we can show and show that value to the federal government, and look at ways for us to kind of continue the support that they've shown through the pandemic. So, as much as we sit in our kind of laurels and the ways that we've done things in the past for a really long time, that tide is changing, and it was never more prevalent than it was in the past 15 months.
Terrific insights. And I think great to hear you all want to challenge the industry. I think that it's incredibly important that we continue to think, and we've done this in the past for ourselves. If you think about the shift is in the recognition of the value we bring to things like transit-oriented development, right? That was a mindset shift. The contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, that's been a mindset shift. And so we know these shifts can happen within our industry, and it does take leadership. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists the same question, and we'll kind of treat this as our last question for each of you, and then slide into our wrap up. And that question is this: so if you put yourself into the future, 18 months, 2 years from now, right? So end of 2022. And you stand before your board and your community stakeholders. How do you want to articulate measurably how you have impacted your community and your organization's success? So really want you to put yourself into the future, thinking about the things that you are focused on now, thinking about this paradigm of value, v volume. What's the story you want to be able to tell your boards 18 months, 2 years from now, your policymakers 18 months from 2 years from now, about the impact that you've had? And we're gonna go ladies first on this one. Kelly, you want to go?
Wow. I mean, we've certainly touched on all of it. I think, I mean, from my perspective specifically, rather than you know, the traditional approach that I talked about earlier on in the session. What I'd like to be able to do is talk about how the existence of our services are touching on all of the strategic priorities of the city, and how our services play a role in all of those, and the value that we're bringing to the community as the result of what it is that we do. So, you know, rather than traditionally focusing on, hey, we provide X% of the trips that are taken within the city. That's the traditional metric. I'd like to get away from that and talk about, you know, how, and Eddie's touched on this, you know, how we're improving accessibility into the community, just community access in general, those type of things. So again, it goes back to that value versus volume discussion. That's, I mean, I don't really have a specific answer, but I think it's generally that theme, talking about the value that our services bring to the community.
So for me, looking into the future in 18 months, I would say that RTD is not only the regional transportation district, but the right transportation decision in reference to moving people around this dynamic region. We're embarking upon a fare study and equity analysis. We have cumbersome fares that may be a barrier for entry for some. One, to ensure, as I said at the outset, with my belief that public transportation is the great societal equalizer, that is very apparent as we go forward in relationship to really looking at our service model and being able to display the value from the sense of, you don't necessarily need a 60-foot articulated bus in your community to have viable transportation options. We could be using a cutaway. We could be using our on-demand micro transit system to move people to and fro. It's ultimately to change that mindset. I would hope would be where we are in 18 months and see some measurable differences as we basically do a baseline in the next month or so of where we are, and we can use that as the line in the sand to say we're here. And even though the progress may be small, but as you move forward, you do it with one step at a time. And as long as we've inched past that baseline, I will basically rally around that and celebrate that success with my team.
I guess for me, it would, I wouldn't want to be telling my story. You know, I think I'd want people to be telling our story. I think that's, for me, is success. So when I look at success of the mobility network here in the city of Edmonton, it's really around, you know, a community success. So my hope is that I wouldn't have to tell that story, that the folks and the people that are using the system are telling that story for us. So, you know, our focus is on seamless transit throughout the region, and that's what we're hoping to achieve. And I think, you know, in 2 years' time, that's the success that we're looking for. So, you know, the narrative around this whole approach for us is really about, you know, hopefully the citizens of Edmonton are the ones telling that story in the future, and they're getting that seamless connectivity that they hadn't had before. So, you know, in that layered approach that Deborah was talking about, you know, it's not always a big bus solution. You know, it's a tailored service for the neighborhood or the place you live, and that we're connecting at all ends of our city. And sometimes that's a big bus, sometimes that's a small bus, sometimes that's a train. But in all those different kind of circumstances, I'd want the citizens to be telling that story and not me having to explain that narrative.
That's great. Thank you all for those visions. Really exciting to see where you will all be going forward as we follow on this path. I'm going to come back to Mark. Mark, what's your vision? Where do you hope we as an industry are when it comes to this topic of articulating value and volume? What do you hope to see as a 30-year industry veteran and a former executive, and having worked with agencies all over North America and around the world on this? Where do you hope we are 18 to 24 months from now articulating success as an industry?
You know, my hope is that each of our three panelists and the 100 or so folks listening in, and then the 1,000 agencies that are not listening in but are going to follow this group, because this is going to be the early adopters group, are going to be able to articulate that those elected officials that voted to send money to transit and to our individual agencies that we're going to be able to articulate that they were right. That when our volume was at its lowest level, they invested at the highest level, and we'll be able to articulate that they were right to have done that. And we won't need to do it with episodic stories or one-offs. We'll be able to articulate the value that we uniquely identify within our communities, whether it's congestion or climate or access or volume or quality or a host of others. Each of our individual agencies will be able to articulate that value in a measurable way, and it will roll up at an industry level, whether it's in Canada or the US or England or wherever the country might be. The industry will be able to articulate that this goes far beyond volume. So ridership is 82% of what it used to be, yet we're able to articulate that customer satisfaction is up 16%. We're able to articulate that access to employment is up 21%. We're able to articulate that greenhouse gas emissions are down 6%. And the way we identify that success unique within our community and say so proudly on our websites and say so proudly in front of it. We don't have to be in a defensive posture of saying that ridership's at only 82%. We proudly embrace in an offense-based way the way we've articulated success. 18 months from now, when CEOs are doing that, and this is going to be the early adopter crowd, I'm going to be the one in the audience just applauding, being so happy that they've done so. So once in a lifetime opportunity, and each of our panelists have said, we need to seize that opportunity. The time is now. We got 18 months. The clock is ticking.
Thank you for that. And thank you all for your vision. Want to thank OPTA for hosting this panel and allowing us to be part of your agenda. I want to extend our thanks to our panelists, Kelly Polexny, Deborah Johnson, Eddie Robar, busy people with a lot to do, and willingness to share your insights and contribute to the industry is not lost on any of us. Of course, want to thank our guests for their attention, and Mark and Lindsay. Bob, if you would, how can folks get in touch with this team, our team, to learn any more about our focus on outcomes in the industry?
Yeah, I just want to say in closing, thanks to everyone for joining us. Thanks to the panelists. It was a great discussion, great to listen to. Lots of interesting thoughts. And yeah, if anyone listening would like to discuss these topics further, please get a hold of me. I think most of you have my email address or my phone number, my cell phone. And I'd be willing to talk to you, but I'm not the one you want to talk to. I can get you a hold of Lindsay or Aaron or Mark. You can tell the passion they have for it. So just want to say thanks again.
And thank you on behalf of the OTE Planning Committee that has been working with OPTA to bring these sessions. Thank you for giving us such a great topic to kick off OPTA Live. I'm receiving emails throughout the last hour and a half with positive comments. So we couldn't have asked for a better topic. Looking forward to more conversations like this. Thank you, everyone.